gamers, Power Heal here, and today we're going to do a Naxx tier list. Now I know what you're thinking, like, oh, the state of this channel, how far we've fallen. We're doing tier list content, right? But I actually think this stuff can be kind of fun, and I think we've gotten most of the kind of like the serious stuff out of the way for Naxx. So we're going to be doing a couple more videos, and if you guys have any suggestions, obviously feel free to leave them in the comments. But I thought this would be like a fun idea to do some Naxx tier list stuff. And this one specifically is going to be about progressions. This is going to be how hard it is to progress a boss. And I feel like I have a pretty good perspective on this because I've done progression through Naxx multiple times. And not only that, but I think doing it from the healer perspective is a pretty good way to experience it because mostly you're doing the same mechanics as the other classes. But it's just that, you know, you also have a sense of like how hard any given fight is to heal, right? And I've also done the Razuvious mind control, so that's another kind of mechanic that will kind of be featured in this. So we're just going to go through each boss and place them into a tier, and then I think what I'm going to do is, like, at the end we might swap some around, right? Because our initial impression about where they're going to go might be incorrect. Our intuitions might be off. So we'll kind of like tidy things up at the end, and then we're also going to do it in a way where if I put a boss first, like towards the left-hand side, it's going to be the harder boss in that tier. Sometimes this is difficult to do with tier lists, like if you're doing kind of like a character power scaling tier list in a show, right? That becomes difficult to do because a lot of times, like, even if you have multiple characters in the same tier, it can be difficult to suss out which one is the strongest, right? Especially if they have certain dynamics between their matchups with each other. But in a situation like this, it's pretty straightforward. I feel like which is just harder to progress, right? And there's probably going to be an answer there most of the time, at least if somebody's opinion, right? Even though obviously a lot of this stuff is subjective. So we'll start here with Anub'arak, right? And we'll probably just work our way through the list. Anub'arak, I think I'm going to put him in D right off the bat. I think we're going to try and use all the tiers as well, just to give us like flexibility. So S tier is going to be the hardest fights to progress, and then A tier is like a step below that, B tier, C tier, and D tier. And I think Anub'arak is definitely has to go into like the easiest bosses. Like I don't really hear many people getting stuck on this boss. The mechanics are relatively simple. I think this is a boss where even if you do wipe on him, it's probably like a one wipe and then you kill him the next time sort of deal. I think the biggest thing that I tend to see with Anub'arak and people potentially wiping is people just not spreading out enough for the impales, and then also the locust swarm. Sometimes people are in a weird position when it comes out. Especially if maybe they're expecting the boss to die before it comes out, right? They're a bit too close to the boss and everybody starts taking damage because it does do a lot of damage. But the thing is, you can pretty much avoid it entirely. So, you know, it's one of those things where if you get caught by it, it feels bad. I believe it also silences as well. So it's one of those things where if your group is in a bad spot and you get like a bad silence and a tank dies or something, and then he kind of runs, like if your tank that's kiting him dies, because healers get silenced, and then he runs into the raid. Now you also have spiders spawning as well, right? So, I mean, it's not impossible to wipe to this boss, but it's very, very easy, and once you figure out what's going on, it's super easy. So it should be a one-shot for most guilds, I would say, even, that have, like, reasonable DPS and reasonably geared tanks. They actually know what to do in the fight and when to kite the boss. And, you know, if you do wipe, it's probably going to be one or two wipes at most. So I'll put him in D tier. Going on to Patchwerk. Patchwerk is an interesting fight because people are going to look at this and they're going to be tempted to put him in C or D tier, right? Because the mechanics of the fight are pretty simple in the sense that, like, people look at Patchwerk as the ultimate tank and spank, right? But in my opinion, it's actually sort of incorrect. I think that he gets looked at as a tank and spank because it's almost like a bit of an iconic fight, because back in vanilla, this was actually a difficult fight because the DPS we had back then, like, we hadn't figured out as much stuff, we didn't use all the world buffs to their, you know, the nth degree, so people's damage was just not anywhere near what it is now, And this is actually, I think, one of the fights that kind of popularized like warriors stacking a little bit. Like, I was definitely back then. I was little, and I used to look in the forums, and I would read what people were saying about Patchwerk, and people were like, oh yeah, you want like warriors on this fight. They were just starting to figure out that warriors actually did decent damage. Nothing like we have now. Like, people weren't stacking raids with warriors, but they were figuring out that, like, yeah, like if you have some extra warriors, like, they actually pump, and you really need pumping on a fight like this. So I remember people talking about rogues and things of that sort. So this can be a difficult fight to progress, in my opinion, mostly nowadays due to the healing. So the DPS factor is not really as big of a thing as it was back in, like, I would want to say 2004, but I don't think it was killed in 2004, right? It was probably a year or so after. But yeah, the DPS factor was more of an issue back then. Now it's just sort of like the healing, and I think it's just because people don't understand how the hatefuls work, essentially. So a lot of people, they're just thinking like, okay, I get assigned to this off tank 1, right? And I'm gonna just heal this off tank, and I'm just going to spam him. But you don't really want to spam him unless you're in a guild that can completely roll over the content, right? Because if your DPS is good enough to kill the boss but not incredible, you might actually on this fight, especially if you don't have a lot of consumes and things like that. So you really want to use your mana in a way that's a bit more intelligent, and that can kind of trip people up. Also, sometimes people overthink it, right? So it's either like they're not thinking at all and they're just spamming and going or they're kind of like overthinking it and trying to get too cute with it, and they're thinking like, oh, I have to like, like, instead of just following the very simple rhythm where it's just like, you cast as soon as you see the tank take damage, like they're trying to do like weird stuff, like where they're trying to like precast or something like that, and then, which for some strategies you might need to precast, but depending on what strategy you're picking, like that really depends on what casting style you're going to do, right? Whether you want to cast as soon as damage goes out or whether you want to precast. So you have to be aware of what strategy your guild's trying to implement to get the most out of your healing there. And I've definitely seen like guilds wipe to this. And this is a fight where if something does happen, like if a tank doesn't get healed or something, it snowballs relatively quickly because he just does so much damage. So the problem is that like, if you have three tanks, let's say, or even 4 tanks, they're set of tank hatefuls, and then one of them dies, it's going to bring another guy in on the chain, most likely. And then he's going to get one shot by the time the hateful comes to him, because he's not in the same gear to allow him to survive that hateful. And then it kind of just keeps going down the line, and if the main tank dies, then that's another problem in itself, right? So tank deaths in this boss, not great, and it's kind of one of those things where it can fall apart quickly. And there's always, like, whenever I watch, like, a speed run or something like that, even in a run where, even when I'm doing a speed run with a group of people that have done this before, there's always, like, a little hitch, like, okay, like, is everybody paying attention? Does everybody have the right tank that they're targeting? Because that could be a thing, too, right? If people just don't pay attention a ton in Classic WoW, you guys know this, and if they're just like, oh, I thought I'm healing tank X, but I have to heal tank Y, well, there you go, you just, like, wiped on Patchwerk and probably lost a bunch of people buffs, and now the fight might actually be hard. So I'm going to say, like, I might actually put this as far as A tier, but I reserve the right to drop it down. Remember, this is for Naxx, right? So we're not comparing this to a race for world first bosses, obviously, right? Grobbulus is next. So Grobbulus, I think, like, I'm tempted to put this boss as one of the easiest bosses in the entire instance. It's definitely going into D. Absolutely right off the rip, but I just don't know where I want it in comparison to Anub'arak. I think that, like, I personally feel like this fight is easier than Anub'arak, but I'm trying to, like, really not just go off my personal intuitions and trying to, like, think about what your average guild would be like progressing this. Think back to when I progressed it with a couple guilds, and there are things that can kind of go wrong on this fight, right? Like, I think in particular, the main one tends to be, I think the big trap in this fight, and this is why I'll actually put it ahead of a noob here. Can I swap? Yeah, okay. I'll put it ahead of Anub'arak, and it's mainly because of dispels. So throughout most of, somebody's classic WoW life cycle as a healer, right? The idea is typically you want to dispel people as quickly as possible, right? That's, everybody, they love that instant dispel on Luciferon, or the buff in MC that makes people do less damage, etc., right? So you're trained to dispel instantly, and this is a boss where you don't want to dispel instantly. It's a very bad instinct to have on this boss, because if you dispel a ranged instantly, a ranged is basically sitting in the middle of the room with the rest of you guys, and he's probably going to drop the poison cloud directly on everybody if you dispel him instantly, because he's not going to have time to get out. So just for that alone, I would say that can make the fight a little bit trickier than something like a noob. And then on top of that, if the positioning gets messed up, the boss will start spawning more blobs because his frontal spray is hitting more of the raid. And that can obviously be a bit problematic, right? So I'll put him in D tier. He's a very, very easy boss. I don't think you should really... if you wipe to him, it's probably going to be to dispels. And, it's going to be a one-time call-out. You can just tell people, if you don't know what you're doing with the dispel, just don't dispel. And that'll probably be fine. You can probably easily still do the fight with only a few people dispelling. So that's how I feel about Grobbulus. He also has this weird mechanic where if you try and kite him and you're too far ahead of him, because if I recall correctly, the reason why you might get ahead of him as a tank is because he stops to either put the puddle on the ground himself when he's putting the puddles below him, or he stops when he does the spray, right? So what ends up happening is he's stopping to cast one of those two things, or maybe he stops even in both cases, and then you're getting too far ahead of him. And if there's not if the target that has threat on him is too far out of his range, he starts doing poison damage to everybody. So that's a bit of a rare outcome. I mean, most tanks know to avoid that, but it's also just something to keep in mind on him. So Gluth. This is an interesting boss. I think we're going to put Gluth. Gluth's going to be our first C tier. I'm not sure. I might move him later. Not a hard boss, I would say, but it definitely... This is the first time, probably, where your raid is going to have to kite things for a prolonged period of time. I mean, it's possible maybe they kited things on, Major Domo or something like that, right? There's definitely other places where you could have kited things, but this is the first time where you're basically going to be forced to kite things. So it's mainly just a check on those people, your kiters. And this is kind of what I was talking about in the Why is Naxx Hard video, right? Where you're already starting to see, just going through this tier list, and talking about where the pitfalls can be for progressing these bosses, that, Patchwerk kind of testing your healers already, right? Gluth testing your kiters, so they're testing different parts of that raid. And it's definitely not, a difficult fight. Intuitive, it should be relatively easy to figure out what the strategy is, even if you were pulling this boss blind. But still, that doesn't mean that the kiting, or that people will be super familiar with the kiting. And I think another thing that can make the kiting a little bit more challenging is if you have healers on this fight that are inexperienced and don't really know what they're doing, if they heal too much too early, they can kind of get a bunch of the zombie chows on them, and depending on how many kiters you assigned and what you're working with, it can be a little bit annoying to kind of wrangle them back in, right? So that's another thing. The healers can kind of make this fight a little bit more difficult if they don't know what they're doing, right? And if you don't anticipate the decimate, then obviously that's going to freak people out, and maybe that could potentially cause a wipe. I think the what was I gonna say? Yeah, he doesn't hit the tank that hard, but yeah, I think I'll put him in C tier for now. So Thaddius, let's see, Thaddius. I want to put him in C as well. Thaddius is not a very hard boss. I haven't really done this fight with very low DPS, and I've done it quite a bit in Lich King as well. Obviously the scaling is a bit different, but really I don't think you're really never in danger of wiping to the enrage on this boss with like any reasonable group. That's what I was mainly trying to think, because like the damage amp just gives you like so much more damage than you need. I feel like to kill this boss, it really shouldn't be close. If you have even like a reasonable raid, and you don't lose a ton of people on the fight, obviously. I think honestly the hardest part of this fight, and the area where I see wipes on this happen the most often, is the 2 mini bosses on the platforms and Mage Ignite. I've seen mages like pull aggro essentially, and that can go really poorly on those bosses. They also can hit quite hard. I've actually seen them kill tanks. I've seen them kill people who aren't tanks when they get aggro, right? So those bosses, I think they mostly just get underestimated, and then obviously, people being clowns with Ignite is something that is always a problem. But in this particular case, it makes it like harder to recover from in this instance, because I believe there's like a threat drop on the throw, right? So it's easier for people to pull threat with Ignite than it would be on other bosses. But I think in terms of the actual fight itself, it's so easy, right? And the thing is, like, you have so much leeway, really, with the polarity. I believe it's like, is it 3? I think it's like 3 seconds or something. I haven't even looked because it's just so easy. You don't even look at the I think there is like a debuff that shows you the leeway, if I'm not mistaken, but I haven't even looked because it's just so easy. You just literally just walk around him, and like it's, I think you have so much leeway that usually you have a pattern, right, where it's like, okay, if you're going from maybe negative to positive, you're going around the front of the boss. If you're going from positive to negative, you're going around the back or something like that. I don't even think that really matters. I think you could, as long as you're like reasonably quick about it, you could just walk through the boss, or like, walk on whatever side you want due to the leeway. So yeah, I think it's just a pitifully easy fight. Not really much to say there. I think just the first part, though, makes it a bit more difficult in these two. And the fact you have to kill them at the same time, like, that can always be a show, Sapphiron. So Sapphiron definitely going in the S tier. Not even a debate. Probably going to stay at the top of the S tier, but we'll see. And yeah, this is, in my opinion, I actually think this is probably the hardest fight in Naxx. It would be this or KT. From a healer perspective, I think this is the fight that's going to strain your... In terms of, like, straining your resources, this is going to be the most intense fight by far. So from a healer, I could definitely see a healer ranking this as the hardest fight in Naxx. I definitely think it's either, like, it's top 3, probably top 2. Probably is the hardest, but at least top 2 or top 3. The damage is just very high, and you're not going to have the frost resist that you want on your melee and your casters going into this on week 1, in the early weeks especially. And this is obviously a prog tier list, so yeah, it's just going to be brutal the first week if your guild doesn't have really good DPS, if you're not used to what you're doing. And this is a fight where, like, if you... even having the consumes, it's still kind of a tough fight. Like, we'll talk about Loatheb a bit later, and Loatheb would actually be like a really hard fight if you did not have access to any consumes, I feel like. But since you do, it actually almost trivializes the fight a bit. Sapphiron, it's you want consumes in the same way you want them for Loatheb, but they actually don't trivialize the fight completely. They just make it feel a lot more bearable, right? So that just kind of goes to show how hard the fight is in general, just in terms of the damage requirements. Just an insane amount of damage that goes on in this fight. And there's just so many, it's everything, really, because it hits the tank hard, the boss, right? So you can't really lax on the tank. A decent amount of the curses go out at once, so you need people decursing, wasting globals on that. You need to watch out for the blizzards. The blizzards do heavy damage. They also slow you if you're in them. So if one gets dropped actually on your head, it's pretty bad. If you're on the outskirts of one, not really a big deal. But if it gets dropped on your head, it's really not good. The ticking damage is so heavy just from the aura going all the time. And then, making sure everybody is high enough so when the blocks come out, people don't just die to the ice bolt that spawns the ice block, that's what's gonna I think cause a lot of deaths for sure. You know, that and people grouping up prematurely and getting like multi-blocked while they're low, also really not great. So yeah, I think those are the things that tend to really hurt in this fight. Also, I've seen tanks die in this fight like a bunch, because this is a fight where you are like really strained trying to keep the raid alive, right? So sometimes people's attention just does inevitably peel off the tank, especially if other healers die or something and you're starting to like see the raid deteriorate. Even if you're a tank healer, right, your instinct is going to be to want to keep people up. Like, you know how like on Broodlord, it's very much a single target healing fight, and you're probably only going to get like one blast wave or one or two blast waves. It's very easy to heal people up in between the blast waves. So if somebody dies on Broodlord like a tank, it's mostly because your healers were just trying to parse on the fight by healing the blast wave targets, and you know, maybe a mortal strike went out at that exact moment. People just got caught lacking, and the tank died. So it's very easy to kind of like refocus people back. Be like, come on, guys, like I get it. Like we're trying to have fun here, but you know, you need to heal the tank XD. The problem with Sapphiron is like there's a lot more of a legitimate argument for healing that raid member on Saff, right? Because you know, it seems like they need it in a lot of cases, right? And they probably do need it. So it's almost like your healing is being split and strained between the tank and the raid, and it's an actual like can be Sophie's choice sometimes, right? Where obviously, you know, you're picking the tank because if the tank dies, everything goes like to hell way worse. But if enough raid members die, things go bad as well. So it's definitely an intense fight. Going on to Kel'Thuzad. Kel'Thuzad, I think, is almost a little bit underrated. This fight is one of those fights where it's a really easy fight on 25 Naxx in Lich King, but in 40 Naxx, I think it's actually, you know, it's arguably one of the hardest fight in the raid. I think it's probably not as hard as Sapphiron, maybe. It really kind of depends. Like for some raids, like these are going to be interchangeable, right? For different raids, like for some raids, KT is going to be a harder boss. For some raids, Sapphiron's going to be a harder boss. It kind of depends what your strength is, I would say. Like if your guild members are just generally not very aware people, I think Sapphiron could actually be an easier fight than Kel'Thuzad, because the mind controls on this boss will like wreck you. Now you can pull the boss enough. The mind controls are sort of RNG, so you could pull the boss enough times where you get a pull where he doesn't really mind control very often, and then you're able to have like a much cleaner shot at a kill. But even on like an average pull with the mind controls, like these guys shred once they get MC'd, right? So they really have to be CC'd in some way. You have to have people that are on the ball. You have to have people that are paying attention to where they're standing, right? With the void zones and more so the frost blast that goes into melee. Like you can't have somebody like cheating when the frost blast comes out and then, you know, get two groups. Like if two melee groups get frost blast, like a lot of people are probably going to die, and that's going to impact your chance of killing the boss, right? There's still a decent like HPS check. The AoE frostbolt goes out, that can't be kicked. I think it's possible for the tank to die if you don't if you let him just chain frostbolts on the tank. It's very heavy damage, but I mean people should be kicking that like the normal one. So there's that. It's definitely like a tough fight. The Kel'Thuzad fight is more about coordination, I would say, and the Sapphiron fight is more about preparation, right? And the one thing I will say is that the Sapphiron fight is a fight that gets way easier over time as you start to get more appropriate gear, right? So not only are we talking about frost resist gear just making this fight easier, but just in general more damage makes this fight easier. More HPS really makes the fight easier. Like the better geared your healers get for this, the better, right? It's not really the same on KT. The only thing that more gear does on KT is it can maybe help you survive some of the mechanics with a bit higher frequency, and killing the boss faster is always better, right? But like having a bit more healing on this fight is not really where it doesn't help you succeed that much, and having frost resistance on it doesn't really do anything, right? So it's not like with Saph, like where once you kind of get all the epic frost resists crafted, right, you'll probably notice a big difference in the difficulty of the fight. Not really the same with Kel'Thuzad. This is a fight where you can kind of like always wipe on it, right, at any given point if things go badly enough. So this is a fight like in a speed run, it can be tough, especially if you kind of go into it on low resources, things of that nature. So I think this is a very underrated fight almost. People are always like, oh, if you down Sapphiron, you can kill KT. And I think generally speaking, that's true. But there's going to be some guilds that actually struggle with KT more than Sapphiron. So it really just depends. Also, something that's worth kind of bringing up because this is a progression tier list. Like, usually I don't like to bring things like this up because we're trying to look at it like we go into every fight with like theoretically an equal amount of buffs, but given this is a progression list, you're probably just not going to have as many buffs or consumes left for KT as you would for Saph. And even if you do like a re-up on stuff, you know, you might end up using a bunch of it on Saph, or even if you do one-shot Saph with world buffs, people are probably going to die. So you're just going to be relatively weaker going into KT in most instances until you get the instance down to a point where you know, you can clear it without many deaths in general. So just a couple extra thoughts on KT. Faerlina. This boss I'm going to put in... I think I'm just going to put it in C. I was going to put it in like the lowest tier, but I think it is kind of like a step up above this tier because there are some things that can kind of combine to make things a little bit dicey. So for example, if she's enraged and, you know, she's just spamming her poison volley and the priest just has no idea what they're doing, I'm pretty sure you can do this fight without quelling the enrage, but I've always just quelled the enrage. So is it impossible, especially if it's kind of like later on in the fight, if, you know, a mind control doesn't happen on one of the acolytes and she goes to enrage for the last little bit? Yeah, you can probably kill her, but it can be a dangerous fight. I could definitely see a guild that, you know, it's kind of like a dad guild, like wiping on this fight because their priests are messing up the mind control. Not only can just like a mind control heartbeat or resist or something like that, but I've also seen people mind control the acolyte and then they just use the ability like where they're standing, and you have to actually go over to Faerlina and be relatively close to her. I believe it's 10 yards, but I tend to just walk like right on top of her if it's possible and then use the ability. Because if you just like mind control him and then use the ability from like where he's mind controlled from, you will absolutely not dispel the boss, and it'll continue to be enraged and do a bunch of damage. It also hits surprisingly hard in melee when it's enraged. So if you are going to let it be enraged for any period of time, you have to keep that in mind. And I think just the fact that we're doing something probably unintuitive with the mind control, and that most guilds are probably going to have to do it, that's at least going to bump it up above these bosses. And it probably goes... I would say it's probably harder than Thaddius. I don't know. It's they're all not really that bad, I would say. The other thing that's like making me think about Thaddius's position in this tier is the jump, because people, I don't know what it is, man. They just can't jump in this game, and they miss the platform. Like there's some people I've seen miss the platform like on 5 pulls in a row or something, like, you know what I mean? Like literally 5 weeks in a row, they miss the platform every time. So if you have enough of those people in your raid, yeah, like Thaddius will be a problem. I don't need, you know. But we'll keep it here for now. So we'll go to Maexxna next, or Maexxna. This boss is, I would say it's decently. It's probably like the hardest boss in the Spider Wing potentially. Most of the worry here is just your tanks, right? Where you want to always have them hotted up and things of that nature when the web wrap comes out. We're not going to take into account like petrying the web wrap strategies for this, because most people are just not going to be doing that. I'm not even sure if you can Divine Shield. I haven't done this in a while. If you can Divine Shield out of the web wrap. I think you might be able to pre-Divine Shield to prevent getting web wrapped one time, but I don't know that you can actually, use it once you've been wrapped already. And I'm not sure if Bop does the same thing. I don't think Bop would do the same thing. I think you might actually need to Divine Shield to protect from the web wrap. So that's something you can do as a Paladin. Horde doesn't really have that luxury, so you have to basically just go with the HOTS, right? And then your tank will swap to a shield before the wrapping occurs. So this boss, a little bit dangerous. I've seen people die on this fight not getting broken out. That can be a thing as well, right? And they tend to be in weird spots, so it's like if the range doesn't break them out, sometimes they won't get healed. But just not really that hard of a fight overall. I'm going to put it in this, and I'll probably reorganize C tier specifically last, as there seems to be a bunch of bosses in there. But yeah, I don't really think mixed. I think it's like a step up over these bosses, obviously, but nothing insane. And we got Noth here. Noth is going in like freebie. I think Noth is actually the easiest boss in the entire instance. The only thing you have to care about is the curse. And like, I mean, I guess maybe if you only had like one decursor or something, but that shouldn't be the case, right? So I guess I feel like in a guild that's going to be worried about progressing this content, it's actually even less of a worry than in like a normal guild, because you're going to have more people available to decurse anyways. So even if people are asleep, the odds that it doesn't get decursed are pretty bad, right? So this is just a super easy fight. Like, if you can't decurse by this point in the game on a fight where like the only thing you have to do is decurse, then I don't know, you don't deserve the loot, right? So Noth is just like, I think he's actually the easiest fight, then probably followed by Anub'arak, then Grobbulus. Heigan. Okay. Heigan. Heigan, I think, is going to be our first B tier, where I don't think it's going to be A tier. Maybe Patch goes down to B, I'm not sure, but Heigan's going to be our first B tier, where there is a mechanic here. It's going to take some getting used to. It's not like an insanely hard mechanic. It can be sort of mitigated, right? Things like protection potions and a little bit of healing from the healers on the platform. But I think that one thing that makes this like really easy is you really just need like one or two people that know what's going on, and they can kind of lead the circus through the the geysers. So that in itself takes a lot of the difficulty away. I think like if this fight was like a pure, like if you were teleported to your own separate instance of the Heigan dance, that would actually be kind of like a fun idea for like a Classic Plus or something, where like every player is like, it's like a, they're put into like their own domain, and then they have to do the dance individually. That could actually be sort of interesting. And that would be a lot more personal responsibility, right? But as it stands now, just not really that hard, I would say. The geysers do a lot of damage, so if you repeatedly get hit, you will die, unless like you're like one of the only people getting hit and you're getting bombed with heals. But you just should be able to not get hit routinely very easily by following somebody. Loatheb. So Loatheb, I definitely at least put into B. May actually be tempted to put him into A. It's just a weird fight, and I think that the weird fight aspect can make it just a little bit difficult to prog. Like, it's weird because you'll explain the fight to people, okay, and you'll be like, yeah, you really can't, you have to have an order here because you can only cast heal every 60 seconds. And I swear, and the thing is, a debuff goes on you when you start the fight. And if you mouse over it, I'm pretty sure it tells you exactly like what the deal is, right? But you'd be surprised because people still just, I think they almost like don't believe you. They're like, nah, they wouldn't do that. That's weird, bro. That's weird. And they'll just cast their heal anyway. And then like it comes time to them, and it's like, oh, I can't heal. Or then you'll have some people, it's like, oh, I just cast a renew, bro. It's like, yeah, that's actually a heal. It says healing on the tooltip, interesting there. So you'll get some like weird things like that with Loatheb that'll make it annoying to progress, honestly. with the order. And like the thing is, you can't do anything as an individual healer outside of calling the order and just hoping other people listen. Is the other part that is a little bit frustrating about it, right? Because you can only do your one heal. So there's nothing like you even if you're like the most vocal person, you're trying to carry by virtue of talking. If people just don't listen, then you're just gonna die on the fight, right? There's nothing else to be said. Something like Diamond Flask is actually really nice in this fight. This is like, I know how I made the video like trashing Diamond Flask a while ago. This is like its time to shine, guys, okay? Like Loatheb is where the Diamond Flask shines. Yeah, it shouldn't be that hard in theory, but it can be hard if people don't respect the order. Also, if people aren't using consumes, that's where things become really tricky, right? Because now you're actually having to cast raid heals, which means that you have to really space the amount of heals that you have on the tank even more, right? And really rely on things like a Diamond Flask, and that like you have to rely on those crutches even more. So we'll think a little bit more once we get more stuff on the board, but it's going to stay. It'll be above Heigan probably for sure. The thing about this fight is like if people aren't potting as well, it's actually like it goes from like 0 to 60, right? Like if you use no consumes in this fight, it would be a difficult fight. Unless you change the amount of healers you bring, is how I would describe it, right? And then the other problem that's like a subtler problem that I've had before in groups on this fight is people not getting the spore, because it's kind of like a quick thing and you need to be sort of close. Like you can't just be like anywhere, right? Because they obviously don't want, the idea is that they want to design a fight where you can choose who gets the spore at a given time, and therefore, you're not, it's not like some guy like in the Bermuda Triangle gets a spore because it happened to go down at a given point, right? So you do have to be on the ball moving in to get the spore. And I've seen multiple groups not get the spore and wipe due to damage on this fight before. So that's something else that can happen. People tend to be like very bad awareness-wise in this version of the game, honestly. So, and the spore is not like the biggest thing in the world, even though it does have a very unique, I would say, look to it. But people just don't even see it sometimes. They'd be like, "What? Spore went out?" Like they're just like sitting there doing their rotation, right? And they're not even thinking about getting the spore, so that can happen as well. And if it happens enough, it'll be a problem. Going into Razuvious here. So Razuvious, I'm actually going to put into A. I think this fight is like it's not that like I'm not. Everybody's going to be like looking at this tier list and be like, oh, the priest player is putting Razuvious in A. He must be a noob, or like, of course he's putting the fight that like priests shine on in A, right? But it's really not like that. It's just that it has the like really big consequences for messing up on this fight, right? Like you can have people die to dance on Heigan. You can even have a couple people die to polarity on Thaddius. You can have people miss the platform, right? You can have healers die to chows here. You can have people just kiters die potentially, as long as not all of them die. Like a lot of things can kind of go wrong on these other fights and it'll be recoverable. On Razuvious, it's sort of like the Patchwerk thing, where like if a tank dies on Patchwerk, like it can be really hard to recover, especially if you're not expecting it. If the mind control kind of fails, especially at the start, it can be really difficult to get things back, because what'll happen oftentimes is that if something goes wrong with the mind control, let's just say you initially did mind control successfully and then it breaks or something like that, like way earlier than you expected before the next taunt goes off. If the boss runs into the view of the raid and then casts the shout, that is going to wipe a lot of groups, because I believe it silences, and on top of that, it's, so like any other subsequent cast that was going out to try and re-mind control an understudy to get him back to where he was, that's going to get interrupted, and then you're not going to be able to repeat it for a bit. And then your tanks are not even going to be able to have any way to try and get threat on this boss if they're silenced, right? And even if they do get threat, I don't think they can pop shield wall when they're silenced, which is really bad, because that's kind of like how you would prevent a tragedy on this fight, right? Is like if things aren't going well, you can actually get a hold of the boss as the main tank. A lot of people think that like, oh, if you're not using the understudy, it's just over, right? The main tank can tank this boss, and I believe he can even tank it, from what I remember, without like, he doesn't need shield wall popped all the time. Like I've had these go relatively smoothly, so I don't have a ton of experience with tanks tanking this particular mob, but I think it's really the unbalancing strike that is the crazy bad part, right? So he does a lot of damage, but if you have healers on the tank, they can survive for a millisecond until the imbalancing goes out. So if they just need to like survive for a couple seconds before an understudy taunts or something, that's doable, you know? And especially if they have shield wall up, they'll even survive the imbalancing, I believe, if they have shield wall up. So it's definitely possible to recover on this fight in certain instances, but you need to have people that know what's going on, like the priest. Like, if something goes wrong with one mind control, another one needs to be on deck with another ad mind controlled, ready to taunt and bring the boss into position immediately. Okay, and then you just like restart the cycle from there. And yeah, I just think that there's a lot that can go wrong, like in terms of like the mind control can just resist, which is like really annoying if you don't have somebody else that's like kind of like the backup mind control in the pull, because now the mind control cast is not like super short, right? And now he's like running at everybody, all the ads are running at everybody, it's chaos. So that can be tricky. It can be like a messy fight unless you have priests that know what they're doing. It's sort of like a binary fight, right? It's one of those things where once people know what they're doing, it's super easy free loot fight, but until then, it's actually a fight that you'll probably wipe on if the priests have no idea what they're doing, and that's why it's going in A, because it's a prog tier list, right? So, it's my thoughts on Razuvious there. Gothik, in my opinion, if you do this fight the standard way where you like split the sides, you know, you put more priests on the live side, and you don't do the strategy where you're just sitting on one side and then letting the other side come to you. I think that is the easier strategy, is to actually split people up, because I've seen people wipe on the other strat for sure, where you just like let people stay on one side. So I think the easier strategy just tends to be to split people up. You know, you CC things if needed. I don't know why I can't talk. And just kind of, it's a relatively easy fight. I think it's actually going to go into D, but it's probably the hardest D fight, maybe. Just because like you kind of can get overwhelmed by ads. It's like, I would say it's like with Grobbulus. The thing about it, though, is that, like, having the ability to CC ads really does change the fight, because it kind of lets you control the pacing a bit, right? It's hard to get truly overwhelmed unless your damage is just, like, really, really bad. So I think it pretty much goes in D tier, and it's part of, like, the free loot tier bosses. I would say pretty much everything in C and D is, like, pretty much free loot if you can get to it. You know what I mean? The problem is, like, Grobbulus is obviously blocked by Patch, and Thaddius is blocked by Patch as well, right? And Gluth is blocked by Patch. So Patchwerk actually kind of gatekeeps quite a few easy bosses in the run, but if you can actually get to them, they're relatively easy. For Horsemen, I'm going to put this in S. I think it's definitely, like, the lowest tier of S, though. Like, I think, like, you could maybe make a debate that it's harder than these two, but I think, realistically, it's probably just going to go in S. And I think that the reason for this is explaining the mark strategy is not really that bad, right? That's why I wouldn't have it overtake Sapphiron and KT, because it's kind of intuitive, I think, what's going on with the marks, in that people at least intuitively understand that you can't be in the same quadrant taking marks from the same boss for a prolonged period of time. So they understand the idea of moving. And also, the middle of the room is a safe spot. So what'll tend to happen is if you really have people who don't know what's going on, right? And they are, like, they took an extra mark or something, and they're afraid. What I do as somebody who would, like, tell people how to do this fight is, like, if you become lost in the order at some point and you have an extra mark than what you're supposed to have, go to the middle, right? And then which mark you just took, right, to get the extra mark that you're not supposed to have. And don't go back to that corner, right? You can go to another corner and help out, but don't go back to the corner where you took the extra mark. So go to the middle of the room, chill out for a second, get your bearings, and then just go to, like, another corner. Because the rotation doesn't have to be perfect from all players in the raid. You know what I mean? You can have people that don't really get what's going on or kind of get lost and get thrown off the rotation a little bit. It just can't happen to everybody. You need enough players in on what's going on. And as long as you have that, it's okay. And if you do the burns, like the faster you can burn one down, the easier the fight becomes, right? Because it's just... now you don't really have to worry at all, basically, right? Or, not once I have to worry at all, but, like, it just gives you a lot more leeway with how you handle the rest of the bosses. I actually think the main wiper on this fight that I've seen is Zeliek and his chain lightning. I think that is more of a problem than the marks, to be honest. And I think if you're just very careful and diligent around Zeliek, if you tiptoe around a bit, really respect him, you'll have a relatively easy time with this fight and this boss. It may take you a little bit to kind of get the rotation down, and it definitely is probably the most complicated fight in Naxx. So that's why I'm putting it in the S tier. But even though it is sort of complicated overall in terms of what's going on, the way I like to break WoW fights down for people when I'm trying to explain or raid lead or anything like that is get people to focus on exactly what they need to do and that only. So it's one of those fights where even though overall there's a lot kind of going on, most players don't need to know a ton about the fight. They just need to know like a very basic movement order for how they're going to be going to these bosses and what happens when a boss dies and stuff like that, right? And even if you just leave them with the very basic line, if they have no idea what they're doing and it's hard to get through to them, even if you leave them with that very basic line I talked about earlier of, like, if you get too many of them, like, we're going to tell you you're supposed to have these marks at this point, and if you have too many marks, just go to the middle or something like that, or get away from the corner you got the last mark from. That goes a long way, and, like, just having that person be able to enter the fight later, especially if they're, like, a healer or something like that, can make all the difference, right? Because, like, if that person would have died, then yeah, maybe it is a bit more of a difficult fight now, because later on in the fight, it is sort of a long fight, right? So maybe mana is a little bit tight or something like that. That can cause some other deaths. But if they're able to go to the middle, just kind of reset a bit mentally, and then somebody calls out, hey, does anybody have too many of these marks? I need somebody on this horseman, to heal or something like that. They're like, oh, no, okay, my mark's cleared there, right? Or I don't have enough of that mark. I can go there and help. And just something like that allows them to still be useful, even if they kind of messed up the overall order. So I think it definitely belongs in S tier, but it's going to be the last bit of S tier. We'll kind of go through everything here. So I like the order. I think I'm going to put Sapphiron first, then KT, then for Horsemen. Like I said, I think these are very debatable and very close, but I think this is probably going to be the struggle bus order for most guilds. Razuvious, and I think I might actually... Let me just take a look at everything. Okay, I think I may bump Loatheb into this tier. And I think I'm gonna go... I'm probably just going to go... We're really nitpicking now, so, I mean, you can pretty much turn off the video if you want, but you can, if you want to follow my nitpicking here, we can finish it out. So, if I have to, like, really pick one, I'd say you're probably gonna wipe more on Razuvious. Again, this is progression mindset, right? So you're gonna have to train the priests here, right? Because if you have priests that are pros at this, then this fight goes to like D tier. So Razuvious probably here. I'd say Patchwerk probably next. Loatheb probably next. Yeah, I'd say that's about right. Yeah, I would say. I think this is pretty. I think Heigan being in B is pretty decent. He looks weird alone there in B, right? But I don't think I want to change D. I think so. This is solid, right? This is S is solid. D is solid. These bosses are like super cake to anybody. I think I really like Gluth in C. I really like Faerlina in C. I think Maexxna is kind of the one that I'm unsure if I put it up to be. I feel like intuitively you want to put Thaddius and Maexxna in B, right? But I feel like Thaddius just really is such an easy fight at its core. And I feel like Maexxna just isn't really that hard either. So I think they're going to have to stay in C, honestly. And let's just let's redo the C tier. So again, we had easiest, right? This is probably the hardest, second hardest. So this is correct. This is correct. So the easiest of these bosses, I'd probably say is Thaddius, actually. Then maybe... I actually think Maexxna is very easy. Because the problem is like everybody freaks out about the tank stuff, but there's just too much focus on the tank for it to be a problem. Like everybody knows the deal with the fight, right? There's not a ton of layers of what's going on. Everybody understands the web wrap's coming. Everybody knows the tank needs to get healed during that, so to keep the hots on, everything like that. The tank knows to put a shield on for the most part. So the fact that you kind of know everything that's coming just makes it so trivial. Even if you're like kind of new, it's very easy to understand what's coming. So I think I'm going to put her there. I think Faerlina actually has a better chance of causing some problems. I won't even lie. And then Gluth, I'm going to put here just because there's the kiting X factor, right? Like you don't know like what your hunters have been doing, right? Until this boss or your mages potentially. I think Heigan being in B is fine, because it is kind of like a step up from the rest of these. But the dance can really like if everybody's new, that's kind of what I'm basing this off of. Then I don't think it'd be unreasonable to think that people would die to the dance a bit, right? And you may have a guy who thinks he knows what he's doing, and it takes a little bit for him to kind of get fully up to speed. So I'll put Heigan in B, and for these. I think the order is right here. I think that, like, it's just the order that I'm struggling with in A. It's going to depend a lot about who your strong players are, right? And maybe I think I don't want Loatheb to be the easiest. Is the thing, right? I think Loatheb is a weird fight. Yeah, I don't know. I think I give up on A tier. They're all just weird in their own ways. So they're like A tier don't really put too much stock in the order here. I put them all sort of like on the same. And then everything else, I think the order is sort of relevant. So that's my Nax difficulty for progging tier list. I hope that was fun. We can do some more of these in the future, potentially, like a tier list for what is the hardest to heal, a tier list for what is the scariest on a speed run, or like another one I was thinking of is like a tier list for like which boss, when you have kind of Nax down and you have it like a mastery over it, which boss are you still afraid to like wipe to most, because it's a very different mindset than a progression mindset. So I think that stuff could all be interesting. Let me know if you guys want to see that in the comments down below, and like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you guys next time. See ya.